A World Bank study has found that crime in South Africa is costing about 10% of its gross domestic product. This is about 640 billion rand per year as households and companies pay extra for security costs. Joining us to unpack these numbers is Dr. Azar Jammine, who's the Director and Chief Economist at Econometrix. Dr. Jammine, thank you for making time for us. So often when we talk about crime, we focus on the impact on the communities, the impact on the victims, on the fabric of society, not so much on the economy, and yet there's a huge impact of crime on this economy.
Very much so, but I think one cannot ignore the impact that crime has on ordinary individuals and companies in terms of the stress that it causes them, because it is also affecting the economy indirectly by encouraging many professional people to leave the country, and that is depriving the country of skills to run this economy properly. And many of the signs of deterioration in our SOEs, for example, are a sign of a loss of a skills hemorrhage from the country to other shores, and we're struggling to replace them with people who know how to do the job. So from that point of view, you cannot totally ignore the indirect effect which crime has in terms of stressing people out through direct crime. But you're quite right, the economic consequences of crime are also one of extremely high cost. And that is that so many different areas of the economy are having to spend money on security systems to try and prevent criminal activity, and that comes as a huge cost and increases the cost of living because some of those costs are then passed on to the consumer. And then one also has the situation where the state-owned enterprises are unable to function properly, not only because of a lack of skills, but also because of criminal activity that is destroying infrastructure. As much as the government then goes out of its way to try and improve infrastructure, we then see the countervailing, so to speak, what are called construction mafia, intercepting such efforts and making it almost impossible for companies to actually embark upon such infrastructural investment. So there are several ways in which the economy is negatively affected. The fact that our rail lines are being sabotaged, for example, and we can't export through our rail network, leading to disastrous administrative problems at ports, and that means we can't export as much as we wanted to, and that, of course, means that we're short of foreign exchange and the currency depreciates as a consequence, and that leads to higher inflation and increases in the cost of living. And who is it that suffers more under such circumstances? It is the poor who don't know how to protect themselves against increases in the cost of living, and they end up being worse off than the rich as a consequence of this. And then you have the indirect effect on the fiscus itself, especially illicit criminal activity that is trying to bypass paying tax. That in turn costs the government in terms of not being able to fund its expenditure appropriately. It then has to borrow more money if it wants to incur those expenditures, and that increases the public debt, which in turn has a negative effect on the currency, and you end up with higher inflation. Again, the worst parts being that the poor have to bear the cost rather than the rich. So it's a vicious circle that we end up with, and it's destroying jobs by the millions.
Yeah. The report also indicates that there are opportunity costs here as well, which reduce the country's growth potential through whether it's the misallocation or the inefficient use of resources. So is the suggestion then that the economy would actually grow if businesses would invest part of what they spend on security, for instance, in productive ventures?
Absolutely. That's exactly what is meant by this, that there is an opportunity cost to having to spend on all this criminal activity. Take your own household even. You don't have to worry about businesses where you have to put in alarm systems and fences, which cost money, and you have less money than to spend on other things that could have actually boosted economic activity.
Mm-hmm. What needs to be done then, Dr. Jammine? While the government has put the fighting crime, at the forefront of its policy priorities, this study, speaks of the need for this multifaceted actions.
It's become quite apparent that the acceleration, if one can call it, the escalation of criminal activity, especially aimed at economic assets, we've had a big escalation of that in recent years, and what is becoming ever more apparent and a source of disillusionment and a source of creating a lack of confidence in the future is the perception that the government is incapable of controlling this phenomenon. And we saw part of that, for example, in the unrest of July 2021, where people suspected that the police were standing around unable to quell the looting that took place at the time. That did a lot of damage to the notion that the government is able to clamp down on crime. And then on the other side is the criminal justice system, and people look and see to try and see whether criminals are being brought to book. And the answer is yes, here and there, but nowhere near to the extent that one would see in other countries. I was looking at a television program yesterday about what happened with FTX in America. This guy, Bankman-Fried, who basically stole money and by the billions, and within a space of a few months, he's now been sentenced to jail. So you can actually see how in other countries, by acting far more actively against crime, they are able to actually stop some of that criminal activity. Not happening here.
Yeah, and part of what investors are considering before they can bring money into the country is also the issue of crime fighting, right? What message do you think South Africa has sent out to investors when it comes to fighting crime? Because investors do care about whether we are a law-abiding country and whether when people are found to do things that are criminal, they're held accountable.
Without a doubt, the high level of criminal activity in South Africa and the damage that it is causing to the economy is now being recognized throughout the world. And in various comparative studies, it is found that South Africa has one of the worst situations in the world. That is a complete turn-off for foreign investment. But it's also a turn-off for domestic investment. One mustn't forget that. The government keeps criticizing the private sector for not investing sufficiently in the economy, even though that is misplaced, because one sees that the private sector has been investing far more than the government itself. The fact is that you cannot altogether blame the private sector for not investing appropriately when it is faced with all these costs and their ramifications. And then now we're seeing the aftermath in terms of public service delivery, such as ports and railroads and energy supply that are being sabotaged. It's a very unfriendly environment for business to operate in.
And do you think, though, our government is also investing enough in, institutions like the NPA? They always talk about how under-budgeted they are, but when you look at where most of the funds are going to, sometimes even in terms of like VIP protection, for instance, government is spending so much money in VIP protection, and yet the NPA will often, have some cases thrown out of court, not so much because they're incapable, but because they don't have the money to go procure the specialized skills that are needed to prosecute those cases.
You have highlighted a great big fault line. And, it actually comes all the way back down to the fact that the government has lost its capacity to govern the country properly. and that has opened the avenue for a lot of corrupt activity, which in turn scuppers the direction of government spending, and spending is directed at areas that it shouldn't be directed at, and not being redirected towards critical areas which you've highlighted, such as in the NPA, such as improving the quality of the police force, such as improving the quality of intelligence and detective work and the like. Without a doubt, you're absolutely correct. A lot of money is being misdirected.
Dr. Azar Jammine, thank you for making time for us.